I wasn't in a good place that spring, and saying it plain feels cleaner than dressing it up. My grandfather had been gone 4 months. The county had started sending letters with red boxes around amounts due, and I had driven back to his place outside Clark Fork with a duffel bag, a tool chest, and the kind of tired that sat behind my eyes like a weight. I was 36, a diesel mechanic from Spokane, on leave I called temporary when people asked, and burnout when I was by myself. The homestead looked exactly like grief looks when nobody has had energy to touch it. Porch rail listing, winter tarp flapping off the woodpile, pasture fence sagged from snow load, and that old galvanized pan still nailed to the cedar post at the tree line where he used to leave cornbread, 2 apples, and a fist of salt every Thursday before dawn. I had laughed about that for years. Not cruel, maybe, but smug. Legend country, I'd call it. Same as the boys at the parts counter. He would shrug, tip his hat, and keep doing it. The first night back, I slept in the back room with no heat, because the stovepipe needed reseating, and I didn't trust it yet. The mattress springs groaned when I turned over, and every board in the place knew exactly where my grandfather's boots had sounded for 40 years, and seemed confused by mine. I woke before light, with my jaw clenched, and pulled on cold socks that felt damp, even though they were dry. I ate leftover beans standing at the sink, drank coffee too hot and too fast, and started making lists on the back of an old feed invoice. Fence line west, culvert check, tax office call, parts run, barn latch, lower pasture washout. Routine kept me upright. That was the rule in my old shop too. If a motor came in blown, you didn't stare at the hole in the block and mourn your luck. You laid out clean tools, checked what still held tolerance, and got to work. Blue found me before I found my pace. He was my grandfather's cattle dog, grey in the muzzle and stiff in one hip, but still all business once boots hit dirt. He trotted behind me fence to fence, stopped when I stopped, watched whatever I watched. If I squatted to pull staples from a post, his chin landed on my knee like he was clocking my effort and making notes. He didn't bark at much anymore, just offered a low grunt when the ravens got bold near the chicken run. I talked to him more than I talked to anyone that first week. "You and me, old man," I'd say while stretching barbed wire by hand, because the come-along had vanished into some shed corner of history. "We're going to fake competence until it turns real." Blue would look at me like he'd heard worse plans. My grandfather's Thursday ritual sat in my mind like a splinter. I could replace posts in frozen ground and rebuild a car blindfolded, but I could not stop replaying him walking to that cedar post with his cap pulled low, moving slowly because his knees hurt, setting the pan down with both hands like the gesture mattered on its own terms. Cornbread, apples, salt, rain, snow, high heat, didn't matter. He did it his whole life. I asked him once, maybe twice, why? He said, good neighbors feed each other through lean weather. That answer irritated me because it sounded like a riddle he expected me to clap for. I never pressed him. I never thanked him for raising me after my dad left, and my mum started 2 jobs and cried in the pantry where she thought I couldn't hear. By the time I got old enough to ask better questions, we had settled into our roles. He did, I mocked. Both of us pretended that counted as conversation. Town didn't help much. The first Tuesday I drove in for fencing staples, hydraulic fluid, and a registered letter pickup, I ran into Wade Connolly outside the feed store. Wade had known my grandfather longer than I'd been alive, and had that careful smile people wear when they're testing your weather. "You holding up out there, Dustin?" Working through a list, he nodded toward my truck bed. "You got enough hands?" "Got me and Blue. That dog's worth 2 men and a bad attitude." I snorted. "He's got 1 good hip and opinions." Wade studied me for a second, then looked toward the hills. "Creek's climbing early this year. Black Creek breakup started before March was done. You keep an eye on that lower crossing. Water'll bite that bank clean if you give it one night. I saw undercut on the east side. Your granddad always cleared the swale before peak melt, like clockwork. I almost said, yeah, and he left snacks for ghosts. Instead, I just nodded, paid for my supplies, and carried the box out feeling 12 years old and foolish in a way I couldn't name. The tax office call went the way those calls go. Friendly voice, hard numbers, no room for story. I made a partial payment from what I'd saved and moved due dates around like cups on a table, trying to find the one order where no cup came up empty. After that, I worked longer days. If my hands were occupied, my head stayed quieter. I reset 6 corner posts on the north boundary, replaced 2 rotten boards on the barn ramp, and shoveled silt from the drainage swale that ran from the upper meadow, down past the smokehouse towards the creek. Mud clung to my boots in heavy cakes, each step a small argument with gravity. Snow still held in the shaded cuts under cedar stands, but the open ground had gone to that half-thawed condition where winter and spring fought every hour. By sundown, I would stand in the yard with my shoulders buzzing and realize I had not spoken a full sentence since morning. Nights were worse because effort ran out and memory did not. I sat at the kitchen table with one lamp on and stared at my grandfather's hands in my own hands. Cracked knuckles, square nails, old burn mark near the thumb. I kept thinking about the last call before he died, how he had asked if I was eating right, and I had told him about a transmission job instead of asking if he was scared. I told myself, practical men don't do speeches. I told myself gratitude can be implied over years. I told myself I'd get back there in summer and we'd have time. Then the hospital called and there was no summer left to discuss. The shame of that settled in my chest in a steady, low way, not sharp and dramatic, just constant, like a belt pulled one notch too tight. By the second Thursday, I caught myself looking at the cedar post on purpose. No plan, just looking. The pan hung there a little crooked, rust ring in the bottom. I stood in the yard with a wrench in one hand and felt ridiculous even considering it. Then I went into the kitchen, cut the last slab of cornbread from a cast-iron skillet I'd made badly that morning, grabbed 2 apples from the icebox, and poured a cup of livestock salt into the corner of the pan. Blue followed me, toenails ticking on the porch boards. "This is not me joining a club," I told him. "This is me honoring an old man who didn't ask permission." Blue sneezed like commentary. I set the pan down, adjusted it level, and walked back without looking over my shoulder. At dawn, the pan was empty except for a clean scatter of salt crystals and apple stem. No crow pecks, no raccoon paw prints in the soft strip of mud below. Just empty, tidy, and quiet. Quiet became the center of it. Out there by midday, wind usually carried plenty. Jays fussing in spruce, chickadees ticking around the feeder hook, branches knocking in uneven rhythm. But certain mornings, usually near first light, the timber on the north edge would settle into a stillness that was not dead and not tense. It felt organized like a shop floor 10 minutes before a foreman unlocked the bay doors. I would stand with a post driver in both hands and listen harder than I wanted to admit, catching the smell of wet fur, churned earth, thaw water, and now and then a clean animal musk that never had the sour edge of rot or den. Blue noticed it too. His ears would lift and angle forward. His tail stayed level. No hackles, no warning rumble. He acted like he was waiting for someone late to an agreed meeting. The weather kept raising the stakes while I was learning to notice. Black Creek ran behind the lower pasture in a steep cut lined by cottonwoods and rock. During deep winter, it narrowed under shelf ice and looked tame from the bank. But break-up season turned it mean in a practical way. Ice rot let go upstream. Chunks jammed against bends. Meltwater from 3 drawers punched through. And the level climbed by inches that looked harmless until they weren't. One afternoon I walked the bank and watched a slab the size of a kitchen table swing loose, hit the outside curve, and bite a new crescent from my pasture edge. Fence posts near the low crossing had started to tilt. The culvert under the county spur road already carried sticks and last year's grass in a tight plug. I drove one more marker stake and felt the current through the ground before I heard it in full. That evening I worked past dark, resetting a hinge on the south gate. My gloves were soaked through and my back had that hot line in the middle that says, "Tomorrow will cost extra." When I finally headed toward the house, I passed the smokehouse and stopped cold. There was a tidy stack of split kindling, maybe 2 armloads, leaned against the wall on dry board so it wouldn't wick moisture from the mud. Not random deadfall. Clean splits, uniform lengths, bark turned down. I stood there with my mouth open, then actually laughed once at myself. A short sound that disappeared fast in the trees. "Sure," I said to no one. "Mystery woodsman doing free labor now." I checked the maul rack. My maul was still by the porch. No fresh chips by my splitting block. Wade had no reason to hike in after dusk and play fairy godfather with firewood. I carried the stack under cover anyway, because practical beats puzzled every time. The next morning, Blue sat at the tree line before sunrise, not lying down, not pacing, just seated with his chest high and tail giving one slow thump every few breaths. He was staring into the fir shadows like he expected someone courteous to step out when I was ready. I came up beside him with my coffee cup warming both hands and looked where he looked. Nothing moved. Mist held low in the drawer, and the first light put a pale stripe across the old cedar post. I felt that same careful notice sensation settle over me. Not fear, not comfort exactly. Something in between that asked for honesty. So I stood there with the dog, cold mud at my boots, grief still heavy, water still rising, and for the first time since the funeral, I said out loud what I'd been carrying around like contraband. I should have asked him why. Blue leaned his shoulder against my leg. The trees stayed still, and I stayed there until the coffee went cold and the day finally made me move. I moved because the north fence still leaned and the creek still ran like it had somewhere urgent to be. I set my cup on the porch rail, grabbed the post driver, and walked out with Blue, pacing at my left knee. The ground had that thawed top layer that looked soft and acted stubborn, mud over hardpan, each step giving half an inch and then refusing the rest. Behind me, the house ticked and settled in the warming light. Ahead, the timberline held its silence, not empty, waiting. By mid-morning, I had 2 braces reset and one sleeve of my jacket soaked from wrestling wet wire. Blue did his old foreman routine, stationing himself where he could watch me and the trees in the same glance. Around 10, right when the sun started pushing a little steam off the open patches, the birds cut out all at once. Jays, chickadees, even the flicker that had been working the dead snag by the smokehouse. One breath they were there, the next breath nothing but creak noise and my own boot scraping mud. I straightened up and listened with the post staple between my teeth, feeling dumb for doing it and unable not to do it. The silence held maybe 20 seconds. Then, just as neatly, chatter came back in from 3 directions like someone had turned a dial. I told myself it was a hawk passing over. I told myself old places train your nerves to hear patterns where there aren't any. I told myself all that while looking toward the cedar post. At dusk I made cornbread again, better this time, less dry in the middle. Blue sat in the kitchen doorway and watched every step with a seriousness that made me feel like I was taking instruction from a retired supervisor. I cut 2 squares, chose 2 apples without bruises, and poured a measured cup of salt into a mason jar so I could see if the amount changed. I carried the pan to the tree line while the last light flattened out across the pasture. "Still not a believer," I muttered, setting it down. "Just respectful. There's a difference." Blue walked past me and sat near the fir shadows again, tail tapping once against the wet grass. Not a warning, more like attendance. That night, sleet hit the window in short bursts and I slept in patches. Each time I woke, I listened for engines on the county spur, for a truck door, for some human sound that would make free firewood and empty pans feel ordinary. I heard none, just weather, creek, house. I was at the cedar post before full light. The pan was empty, apples gone, cornbread crumbs gone, salt mostly gone except for a clean little crescent in one corner, as if something broad had lifted food first and brushed the pan edge with care. No claw gouges in metal, no muddy paw swipes. Below the post, the wet earth held prints, but not clear ones. Heavy depressions too wide apart for a deer, not hooved, edges softened by sleet. I crouched with my hand over one and felt the chill rise through my palm. Blue stepped around the marks without sniffing them hard, which struck me more than the marks themselves. He sniffed everything hard. He once investigated my own boot for 3 minutes after I stepped in transmission fluid. Here he just looked up the slope and breathed steady. By breakfast, I had built 3 explanations and hated all of them. Neighbor prank was first because neighbors are the best answer when you need the world to stay normal. But no boot tread came in from the roadside, and no one with sense hiked in before dawn to eat stale cornbread in sleet. Bear was second, except bears in spring do not leave metal pans undented and salt measured like table manners. My own fatigue was third, the catch-all I trusted most. Only fatigue did not split kindling and stack it on boards out of the mud. I washed my hands in cold sink water and looked out at the smokehouse. Yesterday's stack sat dry and neat where I'd moved it. Beside the wall, where I knew there'd been bare earth, lay another small bundle of pencil-thin twigs tied with grass stems. Tinder. Someone had thought ahead for me. I stood there with wet hands dripping on the floorboards and said, "Okay," to nobody visible, because a man can reject mystery all he wants and still recognize practical kindness when it's set right in front of him. Near noon, I drove into town for feed and to ask after culvert permits, mostly to hear other human voices and reset my scale. The feed store smelled like alfalfa and rubber boots, drying by a heater. Wade was loading mineral blocks into his trailer when he spotted me. "You look like you slept in your boots," he said. "Pretty close." He nodded toward the West Hills. "Creek's coming up ugly. You get your swale cleared." "Working it. Keeps filling with branches." "Funny thing," he said, tightening a strap. "Your granddad always said the hill helped him if he kept his side honest." I gave him a look. "The hill?" He shrugged. "His words, not mine. You know how he talked." I hesitated, then heard myself ask, "You ever see anybody on foot near my place at dawn? Hunters? Kids messing around, anybody?" Wade paused. "Not this time of year. Too wet to be out for fun." "Why?" "Pan at the tree line keeps coming up clean. Wood appeared by my smokehouse." He didn't laugh, didn't smirk either. He just studied my face like a mechanic listening to an engine note. "Could be a neighbor checking on you," he said finally. "Could be critters acting odd. Could be you're carrying too much and seeing extra. None of those mean you're losing your mind, Dustin." Comforting menu. He almost smiled. "You want my practical advice? Keep records, dates, weather, what you set out, what you find. Treat it like diagnosing a hard fault. Pattern first, story later." That landed because it was my language. I bought feed, staples, and a waterproof notebook from the rack by the register. On the cover was a trout leaping out of water, cheerful and unnecessary. I kept it anyway. Back home, I wrote the first entry sitting at the kitchen table. Blue under my chair, stove ticking as it warmed. Thursday dusk. Cornbread ×2. Apples ×2. Salt 1 cup. Friday, dawn, pan empty. No peck marks, no paw scratches. Heavy depressions below post. Birds silent for brief period around 10:05. Smokehouse. New Tinder bundle present. I felt mildly ridiculous and strangely steadier, both at once. Over the next 3 evenings, I settled into that pattern like it had always been mine. Offer at dusk. Check at dawn. Log details before coffee cooled. Work through daylight on whatever the place demanded. The ritual shifted something in me I hadn't planned. For the first hour after each check, grief took 1 step back. It didn't leave. It just loosened its grip enough for curiosity to breathe. Saturday brought rain and a wind that pushed from the south. I left apples and a heel of cornbread, plus salt. At dawn the food was gone again, but this time 2 smooth creek stones sat beside the pan in a clean X. Each stone about the length of my hand, mud washed from them as if they'd been rinsed before being placed. I looked around for crow activity, for raccoon tracks, for any prankster sign. Nothing but rain stipple and my own boot prints from the night before. I picked up 1 stone. It was cool and heavy and real as a lug nut. I set it back exactly where it had been. On Sunday, I found windfall branches dragged off the calf path that ran between the lower pasture gate and barn lot. Not snapped, not scattered, but pulled into a tidy row, clear of hoof travel. The branches were thick enough that I needed both hands to move one when I tested it. I had not done it. I knew because I'd sworn at those same limbs the day before and decided I'd get to them Monday. Blue walked the cleared path once, then looked toward the timber and gave a short chuff through his nose, the sound he made when he recognized the mail truck before it came into view. "Yeah," I said, because talking out loud had stopped feeling foolish. "I see it." Late that afternoon, I was down by Black Creek checking the low crossing where the fence line dipped. Water had gone from cold and fast to cold and pushy, carrying bark strips and rotten ice chunks that spun in small vortices against the bank. The culvert under the spur road was half clogged now, with willow whips and old grass packed into a V. I started clearing by hand with a rake and got soaked to the knees for my trouble. Blue stayed up on the bank, whining low each time I stepped too close to the edge. That was when I saw the elk sign near the old illegal snare line somebody had once set years back in the cottonwoods. Most of that wire had rusted out, but 1 loop still caught brush in spring runoff. Fresh hoof skids marked the mud there, deep and frantic for maybe 6 feet, then straightened. The snare wire was bent open, not snapped. No tufts of hide, no blood, just churned earth, 1 knee mark where a heavy body might have knelt, and tracks leading back toward higher ground. I crouched and stared at it, while rain moved through the cottonwood buds in a soft hiss. This was no clean machine cut, no bolt cutter marks. The wire had been pried and twisted with brute force and patience, enough to widen the loop without tearing it. I touched the metal, still cold from the water, edges rounded by age and use. I told myself this couldn't be real. I told myself there was always an ordinary answer and I just needed to work harder to find it. I wanted to walk back to the house, write "bear" in the notebook, and call the case closed. But nothing in that mud looked like panic or predation. It looked like somebody had stood there in the rain and done careful work because a trapped animal was hurting, and that mattered. I kept trying to summon fear and got this other thing instead, this aching pull in the chest that felt a lot like shame and hope mixed together. I knew somehow that I wasn't in danger. I just wasn't ready for what that meant. I cut the remaining snare wire out and coiled it into my pack. By the time I climbed back to the pasture, the rain had eased and a pale band of evening light sat under the cloud deck. Blue trotted ahead, then stopped so abruptly I nearly bumped him. He wasn't staring at me. He was staring at a mule deer doe in the open strip near the North Cedars, maybe 50 yards out. She was feeding, head down, ears loose, completely unconcerned by us. Then I heard it. 3 heavy footfalls from inside the cedar stand, measured and slow, moving parallel to us behind the tree trunks. Not crashing, not charging, just weight placed with intention. The doe lifted her head once, looked toward the sound, then went back to feeding. Blue's ears stood high, but his tail stayed easy. One slow sweep. "Whoever you are," I said quietly, feeling my throat tighten for reasons bigger than fear, "you're doing a poor job of being a monster." The footfalls stopped. The birds held silent for a long beat, then resumed from the alder drawer as if receiving permission. That night, I didn't sleep much, but not from dread. My mind kept replaying details like a wrench ratcheting in the dark. Crossed stones, cleared path, bent snare, deer calm, dog calm, clean musk in still air. I lay there in the back room and watched moonlight slide along the ceiling seam and admitted something I had resisted since I rolled into the driveway weeks before. My grandfather's ritual had structure, repetition, reciprocity, respect. He hadn't been feeding a story to entertain himself through old age. He'd been maintaining a relationship I was just now clumsy enough to notice. Monday came bright and cold. Frost on the shaded grass, melt by 10. I took the notebook and a tape measure to the cedar post like I was surveying a job site. The pan held no food by dawn, same as before, and beside it sat a new arrangement. 3 short sticks laid side by side, all pointing toward the lower pasture. Not random drop. Deliberate placement, ends aligned. I looked where they pointed. Down slope, past the smokehouse, toward the swale that fed the creek. "Fine," I said, and even to my own ears I sounded like a man negotiating with weather. Message received. I spent the whole day on drainage. Shovel, rake, mattock, repeat. I cut a cleaner channel through the choke point by the old stump and widened the outflow near the cottonwoods. Blue ranged ahead, then doubled back every 15 minutes as if checking my progress. Twice during the afternoon, I found debris piles already sorted at the swale edge, heavy branches stacked where I could grab and toss them easier. I hadn't made those piles. No drag marks from ATV tires. No fresh human boot tread. Just work done in advance of me, like someone had walked the line at dawn and set up the next task. By sunset, my shoulders shook when I lifted my coffee cup. But water finally moved where it ought to move. Instead of spreading into the calf lot, it ran in a narrow, quick ribbon toward the creek. I stood there listening to it and felt the first clean satisfaction I'd had in months. At the tree line, I set down 2 squares of warm cornbread, 2 apples, salt, and, after a long pause, a strip of jerky from the packet in my coat pocket. "Grandad," I said to the fur shadows, not caring how I sounded, "if this is what you are doing, I'm late, but I'm trying." Blue sat beside me and leaned his weight into my shin. From deeper in the timber came that soft, heavy cadence again. One step, then another, circling wide so as not to crowd us. The smell of wet cedar rose with a faint, clean musk under it. No threat in it. Just presence. I didn't chase it. I didn't call out again. I stood still until the light drained off the pasture and the first stars showed above the black line of ridges. Then I carried my empty hands back to the house, less alone than I had been that morning. Inside the house, I hung my coat by the stove, opened the notebook, and wrote by lamplight while Blue circled twice and settled near the door, like he was keeping an appointment. My hand was still shaking from fatigue, but the lines came out clean. Core Thursday offering unchanged. Cornbread, 2 apples, measured salt, jerky added as extra. Heavy steps heard at tree line, circled wide, no crowding. I set the pencil down and listened to the rafters tick as the night cooled again. There is a point when skepticism stops feeling like discipline and starts feeling like stubbornness for its own sake. I wasn't ready to surrender it, but I could feel the edge wearing down. I banked the stove, checked the latch twice, and lay in the back room with my boots lined up by habit. Sleep came in pieces. Each time I surfaced, I heard creek water pushing harder through the dark. At first light, Blue was already on his feet, tail low and steady. We walked to the cedar post through mist that clung to the grass and soaked my cuffs. The pan was empty again, and beside it sat a short length of old fence wire coiled into a neat circle. Ends folded inward so nothing sharp stuck out. It was from my lower crossing. I knew the rust pattern. It felt like being handed a tool in silence by someone who had watched me work all week. I dropped the coil in my pocket and headed downslope to Black Creek. The swale I'd widened yesterday had moved water clean through the night, but farther down, where it bent by the alder break, a fresh pile of flood trash had been dragged out and stacked above the line where current could grab it again. Whole arm-thick limbs, root wads, cattail mats, sorted by size like a crew had done it. I stood there with both hands on the shovel handle and looked at the timber. "You're making me look lazy," I said, and Blue huffed once like agreement. Then the birds cut quiet for that familiar pocket of seconds. Not long, long enough. From somewhere up the slope came 3 soft knocks of wood against wood, then stillness, then bird chatter returning in layers. I worked till noon with that rhythm around me, sweating through my shirt under a cold wind, clearing what I could while the creek gnawed at the low bank with that patient, grinding sound that means trouble is coming on schedule. By late afternoon, clouds stacked in from the west, bruised grey under a strip of weak sun. I hauled a replacement rail toward the lower gate where the fence dipped near the crossing. The old rail had split at one bolt hole over winter and sagged enough that a calf could slip through if I got unlucky. Blue ranged ahead, stopped, looked back at me, then looked toward the alder gap where the pasture met the timber. He didn't bark, he just waited. I was kneeling to set the rail when I felt, more than heard, weight moving across damp ground. I rose slow, rail in hand. He stepped out in the open with the kind of care a man uses carrying a sleeping child. 3 measured steps, broad shoulders dark against the silver grass, fur slicked in places from drizzle. He was taller than the top wire by a full head, and then some, chest wide as my truck hood, arms long enough that his hands hung near his knees. Nothing rushed in his movement. He looked at me once, steady, amber-brown eyes under a heavy brow, then shifted his attention to the broken gate as if that was the point of being there. Blue sat down beside me. Sat down. I was holding a rail and staring like a fool while a creature bigger than any bear I'd seen in Idaho reached with one hand, lifted the sagging gate section that had fought me for 20 minutes, and set it upright against the post so cleanly the hinge holes lined up. He kept his body angled away, giving me room, not crowding the fence line where I stood. Rain tapped the wire. My breath sounded loud in my own ears. In my head, everything went plain and immediate all at once. I wasn't dreaming. I wasn't drunk. I knew what wet steel smelled like. I knew what mud looked like on fur and boots and fence boards. I knew the weight of that gate because my shoulder still ached from trying to move it alone. I should have run, maybe. I should have shouted, maybe. But none of that fit what was happening. He was helping. That was the shape of it. He was helping and waiting to see if I could take the next step without breaking. Blue was calm. The birds were quiet but not gone. The creek was loud. The world was real, and this was in it. I swallowed, set my end of the rail into place, and reached for the bolt. My fingers fumbled once, then found the thread. He held the gate steady without strain while I tightened both nuts with a wrench. When I stepped back, he released the weight in a slow, careful motion so the latch didn't slam. Then he took 2 backward steps, palms open at his sides, eyes still on me, and turned toward the alder. In 3 strides he was back in the cover, shape breaking into shadow and trunk and rain. I stood in that field until my neck got cold from the weather running down my collar. Blue walked to the spot where he had stood, sniffed once, and returned to lean against my leg. In the mud by the gate were prints deep and long, heel and toe clear where the ground held them, splayed slightly from weight. No claw marks, no scramble, just placement, deliberate and even. I took out the notebook and wrote with rain stippling the page. Full sighting at lower gate. Approximately 80 yards, then 20. Helped lift and align broken rail. No threat display. Dog calm entire time. That night, I called Wade from the kitchen wall phone because saying nothing to anyone felt heavier than saying something badly. He answered on the 4th ring with wind in the background. "Connolly." "It's Dustin. You got a minute?" "Yeah, you all right?" I looked out the window at the black line of trees. "I'm going to sound off, but I need a straight ear. Something big's been helping on my place. Tonight I saw it clear as fence wire. Upright, dark fur, near 9 feet. Moved like it was trying not to scare me. Lifted my gate into position while I bolted it." Wade let out a long breath. "You want me to tell you you're cracked from grief?" "No." "Then I won't. You scared?" I thought about Blue sitting in the rain, tail quiet. "No." "Shaken, yes. Scared, no." "Then keep your routine. Keep distance. Keep notes. Stormline says 2 days of hard runoff. Focus on that creek. Whatever else is true, water won't wait." After I hung up, I made coffee I didn't need and sat at the table while Blue slept and twitched in his paws. I kept replaying the way that huge hand had held the gate still while I tightened 2 cheap bolts from a coffee can. Not magic, not a trick, a shared task. I laughed once under my breath at the plain absurdity of it, and the laugh turned into something softer that sat behind my ribs. My grandfather had said good neighbors feed each other through lean weather. Maybe he had meant exactly what he said. The next morning brought brittle cold and sharp sun. Frost glazed the bucket rims outside the barn, and every mud patch wore a thin skin that cracked under my boots. At the cedar post I found the pan empty and, beside it, 4 short sticks laid in a straight line with one angled across the end, pointing downslope toward the swale choke by the old stump. Blue looked from the sticks to me as if waiting for me to keep up. I grabbed shovel and mattock and headed down. At the choke point, a whole cottonwood limb had lodged overnight, thick as my thigh, branches netting debris into a dam that sent water toward the calf lot. I hacked at it for half an hour and barely budged it. When I stopped to breathe, the birds went quiet, and that clean musk moved through the cold air. I turned and saw him 20 yards upslope, standing half between 2 cedars, watching my hands on the tool. I did what had become natural and spoke like he understood plain work talk. "That limb has me whipped." He didn't answer, of course. He stepped down the bank, not hurrying, gave Blue a wide berth, crouched and gripped the lodged cottonwood with both hands. The wood creaked, roots tearing free of mud in a slow rip. He lifted, pivoted, and laid the whole thing on high ground where the current couldn't reclaim it. Then he pointed, one broad finger, to a second snag under the waterline I hadn't seen, and stepped back. Disbelief didn't vanish in one grand moment. It dissolved by degrees, like frost under sun. He wasn't hiding from me now, and he wasn't pressing closer either. He kept the same respectful arc each time, as if my comfort mattered to him as much as his own. That symmetry did more to settle me than any track or smell or moved branch. I waded in with the rake, hooked the hidden snag, and together we cleared it, me dragging from one side while he stabilized from the bank. Water found the channel and rushed through in a clean, urgent ribbon. Blue trotted down and drank from the edge, unconcerned. A mule deer buck appeared along the fence rise and stood chewing cud, ears rotating lazily. No panic anywhere, just work. By evening, the wind shifted and sleet began in needles. I moved my last pregnant cow, June, into the upper lot with extra hay, checked her twice, and laid down dry bedding in case she calved early. She was my best cow, and the last one of my grandfather's line I had left after a hard year. I ran my hand along her neck and felt her shiver under wet hide. "You hold together tonight," I told her. "I'll do the same." The storm hit hard after dark. Not dramatic, just relentless. Sleet against tin, creek roaring higher every hour, the kind of weather that finds weak spots you didn't know you had. Around midnight, Blue came to the bed and whined low. He only did that when stock was unsettled. I pulled on boots and coat and went out with a headlamp bouncing in the white slant of sleet. June was up and circling in the lot, agitated, refusing the corner nearest the drainage cut. My light found why. The cross-fence panel had collapsed where posts softened, and runoff was backing behind it, turning the lot edge into sucking mud. I slogged to the panel and tried to lift it clear. It was welded wire and soaked lodgepole, heavier than it looked, pinned by current pushing trash against it. June bawled once and stepped wrong, one rear leg sinking to the hock near the mud edge. Blue barked sharp from the high side, then ran a tight circle and came back to me. The birds were silent in the storm, but I heard him anyway. Heavy steps through sleet, unhurried, closing from the cottonwoods. He came into my headlamp for a second and filled it, water sheeting off fur, eyes steady. I pointed at June without thinking. "Her! Help her first." He moved past me at an angle, slow enough not to spook her more, and planted one arm broad and solid along her shoulder line, not forcing, just bracing while she found footing. With his other hand, he caught the panel where it had twisted, lifted it up and away in one clean motion, and set it over the fence on dry ground. I grabbed June's halter rope, Blue flanked her opposite side, and together we guided her up the firmer track toward the barn apron. She stumbled once, recovered and kept moving, breathing hard but steady. At the top of the rise, she stopped and turned her head back. So did I. He was already at the drainage cut, kneeling in sleet, pulling packed branches from the mouth of the channel and tossing them clear, each throw controlled so nothing came near us. I splashed back down with the rake, and we worked shoulder to shoulder in weather that would have beaten me alone. He broke the main jam. I cleared fines. Water dropped 2 inches in minutes, then more, peeling away from the lot edge and back into the swale where it belonged. When the immediate push was over, he stood and looked toward June under the barn light. She was calm now, chewing, ears forward. He looked back at me. I put my hand flat to my chest without planning it. Gratitude too big for speech and too simple for anything else. He held my gaze for one quiet beat, then stepped backward into sleet and dark, shape fading through cottonwood trunks until only weather remained. By the time I got back inside, soaked through and shaking, Blue had already curled on the mat by the stove, satisfied in that practical dog way that says the herd is accounted for. I stripped off wet layers wrapped in a blanket and sat at the table while dawn's first grey began to find the window glass. My notebook page wrinkled under dripping sleeves as I wrote, "Midnight storm. June in trouble at lot edge." He braced her, removed panel, cleared drainage with me. Deliberate aid. No aggression. Kept distance. Left when work done. I set the pencil down and listened to the creek running lower than it had an hour before. Not safe yet, but no longer climbing the same way. Out at the tree line, the cedar stood black against a paling sky. For the first time in a long while, grief and gratitude sat in the same place inside me without fighting. I sat at that kitchen table with a blanket around my shoulders and watched the window go from black to charcoal to the thin grey of morning, listening for any change in Black Creek's voice. For a little while it sounded lower, less frantic, and I let myself believe we had stolen enough ground to catch our breath. Then Blue's head came up from his paws. He didn't bark. He just stared at the door, ears forward, body tight in a way that ran straight through me. A second later, the creek's note changed again, deeper and heavier, like a loaded truck, dropping into too low a gear. Upstream ice must have let go all at once. I was on my feet before the thought finished. Outside, sleet slanted hard across the yard. The swale we'd cleared in the night was still carrying water, but now the whole lower pasture looked wrong, sheeted in a moving skin that hadn't been there an hour ago. The fence at the low crossing had vanished under brown current. I counted cattle by habit, lips moving without sound. One shape was missing from the high lot. For a second, through sleet and barn steam, I thought I saw June by the barn. Then the curtain of weather shifted and I saw what I'd missed. She had calved early, and at some point between my checks, the newborn had slipped through the broken section near the cottonwoods, drawn downhill by mud and panic. June had followed as any mother would. Now, both were stranded on a shrinking mud rise out past the old gate line, water shouldering around them from both sides. The calf was still trying to stand and folding back down, legs too new, hide slick and dark with birth and sleet. June's head swung from me to the current and back, eyes white at the edges, bawling in short, rough bursts. Blue whined once, high and thin, then looked at me like he was waiting for orders I didn't have. I grabbed the long rope from the fence post and waded in 2 steps before the current shoved hard enough to turn my knees. It was chest deep 3 yards farther out, faster than it looked, full of branches that hit and spun. I backed up, swore at myself, paced the bank for a seam, found none. I told myself this couldn't be real, this moment where every practical answer ran out at once and all that remained was a mother, her calf, and water with no patience. I wanted to be the man who solved it with rope angles and leverage. I wanted to be enough by myself. Instead, I stood there with sleet in my eyes and admitted I was outmatched. I wasn't ashamed of fear right then. I was ashamed of pride, of every year I had mistaken isolation for strength. Blue's ears snapped toward the cottonwoods before I heard anything. Then the trees parted and he stepped out fully into the open floodlight of morning storm, no shadow to soften his size now. He was enormous, soaked through, fur dark as wet bark, chest rising slow and steady. The current hit his legs and split around him. He didn't charge, he didn't posture. He looked at me first, held that look 1 heartbeat, then shifted to June and the calf, as if we were workers at the same problem, and he was waiting to see whether I'd follow his lead. He moved into the water on a diagonal, not straight for the mud rise, feeling with each step for footing under the churn. Halfway out, he angled left where the surface flattened for a narrow strip over buried gravel. A safe seam. one my eyes hadn't caught through the noise. I got it then, like a wrench finally seating. I clipped the rope around my waist, motioned Blue to stay bankside, and mirrored his line from 10 yards downstream, boots sliding and catching where the gravel held. At the rise, June tried to lunge and nearly toppled the calf. He raised one broad hand, palm out, and stopped just short of touching her face. Not force. Presence. She froze, nostrils wide, then lowered her head a fraction. He slid his forearm along her shoulder line, bracing her against the push. With his other arm, he reached down and lifted the calf against his chest in one careful scoop, supporting belly and hindquarters like he had done this before. Like he understood exactly how fragile first hours are. The calf kicked once, then went still except for its shivering. I took the rope free and stepped closer from my side of the seam. "Easy, girl," I told June, voice rough and useless and all I had. "Easy, we're going." Blue tracked us from the bank, running parallel, barking short directional bursts when I drifted too far toward deeper water. He wasn't panicked. He was working. We moved as a unit without speaking. He set the pace, slow enough for June to place each hoof, fast enough not to lose ground. I walked slightly downstream with the rope taut to guide her head into the channel he'd chosen. Twice debris struck my thighs hard enough to spin me, and each time I felt that broad arm shift behind June and hold her line. The current climbed to my ribs, then dropped to my hips as we found the gravel bar under the brown surge. 20 feet felt like a mile. Then June lunged the last step and hit firmer mud, nearly dragging me onto my face. Blue was there, circling the calf's landing spot, whining and wagging at once as if his body couldn't decide one emotion. He knelt and lowered the calf onto grass above the waterline with a gentleness that made my throat lock. June stumbled to it and began licking in frantic strokes, low rumble in her chest changing from panic to claim. The calf sneezed water, shook once, and made the smallest sound I ever heard carry so far. I bent over with my hands on my knees and laughed one broken breath at the sight of myself. A grown diesel mechanic, soaked to the skin, giving traffic directions in a flood to a creature taller than the barn door, while my old cattle dog supervised like county management. It was absurd in the cleanest way, and then it wasn't funny at all, because relief hit so hard I had to sit down in the wet grass before my legs quit on me. The flood still wasn't done with us. Upstream, a jam had built at the county spur culvert, and every minute it held, water backed through the pasture like a slow fist closing. He stood and looked toward that choke point, then toward me. Same quiet question. Next task. We went. Blue stayed with June and the calf until I whistled him in, then raced ahead along the bank. At the culvert, the jam was bigger than yesterday. Logs crossed with root balls and wire grass packed so tight the pipe had become a wall. Water fanned sideways into my field. I dropped to my knees in icy runoff and started yanking smaller branches clear while he took the outer logs one by one, lifting, twisting, placing them high where they couldn't roll back. No wasted motion. No display of strength for its own sake. Just labor. When one root wad stuck in the pipe mouth, he crouched and worked it loose in increments instead of ripping, giving me time to cut old fence wire wrapped through it with bolt cutters. The moment it came free, the culvert took a hard breath and swallowed. Water punched through in a roaring column, then settled into a strong, straight pull. The backed-up sheet across the pasture began to drop so fast, I could see grass heads reappear in minutes. We kept at it until the flow ran clean and the bank stopped sloughing. By then, sleet had softened to cold rain, and my hands shook from effort and adrenaline and everything else. He stepped back from the culvert, chest heaving once, twice, then still. We stood there in the runoff stink of wet grass and churned earth, watching the creek do what a creek is supposed to do when you give it room. That was when it broke open in me. Not a tidy tear, not a movie speech. I sat down on the muddy shoulder by the road and cried with my face in my hands like I hadn't since I was a kid. For my grandfather. For the phone calls I cut short. For all the times I thought love had to sound like explanation. Blue pressed against my hip, warm and solid. I looked up through rain and said into the space between us, "I should have listened better." He didn't move closer. He just stayed, weight planted, watching with those calm old eyes until my breathing evened out. By late afternoon, the worst had passed. June and her calf were bedded dry in the upper barn, both drinking and steady. The pasture was a mess, but it was standing. The house was standing. The culvert ran open. I went inside, changed into dry clothes, and started cornbread with hands that still trembled. I cut 2 thick squares, polished 2 apples on my sleeve, filled the salt cup level to the rim, and carried the pan to the cedar post as evening fog began to gather low between the firs. I set it down, straightened it, and stood there longer than usual. "Grandad," I said, voice catching and then clearing, "I never thanked you for any of it. For the roof, for the work, for raising me when you didn't have to, for teaching me to fix what I can and feed what I can't explain. I was proud and stupid and late. I'm sorry." Tears came again, quieter this time, and I let them. Blue sat at my side and leaned into my leg until I steadied. From the fog-soft trees across the line, he appeared at a distance where we could see each other and still keep the respectful space he had always held. He didn't approach the pan while I was there. He stood broad and still among the pines, rain beading on fur, and watched. I put my hand to my chest, the same way I had by the barn. After a moment, he lifted one hand and touched his own chest in the same place, a small, deliberate gesture that carried farther than any words could have. Then he lowered his arm, turned without haste, and walked back into the timber until the fog and trunks took him. I stayed by the cedar post until full dark, not because I expected him to return, but because leaving felt like ending a prayer too quickly. When I finally walked to the house, Blue at my heel, the creek sounded lower and cleaner in the night, and the silence in me had changed shape. The next morning, the lower pasture was muddy but draining, fence lines scarred yet repairable. I walked the whole boundary with a shovel and notebook, checking for new undercut, marking posts to reset, tallying losses. 1 panel gone, 2 rails split, 1 mineral tub halfway to Montana. June's calf, bull, white star on the forehead, wobbled after her in the barn lot and figured out legs by stubborn trial. Each time he toppled, June nudged him up, and Blue stood nearby with patient disapproval, as if coaching. I drove into town around noon for feed and culvert forms. Wade met me outside the store, saw the mud up to my knees, and said, "You either won a war or got drafted into one." "Bit of both," I said. He loaded my bags in silence, then leaned on the truck bed. "You want to tell me what happened?" I looked at him a long second and decided plain was easier than clever. Flood took the lower line. June and Newborn got stranded. He came out in full view, carried the calf, braced June, showed me the safe seam. Then we cleared the culvert jam together and dropped the water. Wade rubbed his jaw and nodded once. "Homestead still there?" "Yeah." "Then I don't need to argue details." He gave me a sideways look. "Your granddad used to say respect first, understanding second. Drove me nuts. Maybe he had the order right." On Thursday before dawn, with frost silvering the grass again, I made the offering without hesitation. Cornbread, apples, salt. No bargaining in my head this time, no test language. Blue and I stood back. The timber held its deep morning quiet, and somewhere beyond sight, a branch settled with a soft crack. I went on with chores. At noon, the pan was empty and clean. Beside it lay a smooth, flat stone the colour of river iron, warmed by a thin square of sun that had found the post. I picked it up and felt a shallow groove worn through the middle, as if water and time had held it for years. I set it on the kitchen windowsill above the sink where I'd see it every morning. A week later, my mother came up from Spokane in her little sedan, tires caked in half my driveway, before she reached the porch. She stood there with a grocery bag and that look she gets when she's bracing for bad news. "You said on the phone you had something important. You look tired, honey." "I am tired," I said, taking the bag. "Come in, coffee's hot." We sat at the table where I'd done all my worrying, rain ticking faint on the roof. She asked about taxes first, then fences, then whether I was coming back to the shop. I answered each one straight. Payment plan filed, fence mostly mended, not going back yet. Then I told her the rest, from the first empty pan to the floodline to the chest touch in the fog. I didn't sell it. I didn't decorate it. I spoke the way I'd log a repair. What happened, where, when, what changed after. She listened with both hands around her mug, eyes moving between me and the window. When I finished, she stayed quiet long enough that I could hear Blue's nails ticking in his sleep. "Do you believe me?" I asked. She exhaled slowly. "I believe you saw what you saw. I believe your grandfather had reasons he didn't explain to everybody. And I believe, whatever happened out there, you sound like my boy again instead of a man drowning on dry land." That landed harder than any argument could have. I laughed under my breath and wiped my eyes with the heel of my hand. Fair. She reached across and squeezed my wrist. "Keep the place if it gives you peace. Sell it if it breaks you. But don't choose from shame." We spent the afternoon replacing 2 porch boards that had rotted at the ends. She held the pry bar while I reset screws, and every so often she'd stop, look out toward the tree line, and not say anything. At dusk, she stood on the porch with me as I carried the pan out. I set it down, and we walked back together without looking behind us. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. By early summer, I had the porch rail plumb again, smokehouse roof patched, swale deepened with proper slope, and the culvert mouth screened with removable bars, so spring trash couldn't knit itself into a plug. County signed off the drainage work with barely a shrug. Taxes were still tight, but not a noose. I took on 2 days a week helping Wade with equipment repairs to keep cash moving. In the evenings I came home, fed stock, and sat on the step with Blue watching light, thin, over the north timber. Some nights I sensed that careful attention from the trees and left an extra heel of bread. Some nights there was only wind and jay chatter, and the ordinary holiness of chores done on time. One Thursday in late July, I woke before the alarm and stepped outside to a dawn so clear it made every cedar needle look edged in glass. Mist hung low over Black Creek, gold at the top where sun found it. I carried the pan to the post, set down cornbread, apples, salt, and added a handful of blackberries from the fence line because they were there and ripe and felt right. Blue sat, tail tapping once against my boot. I spoke quietly, not to summon, not to prove. "Thank you for the flood. Thank you for the gate. Thank you for teaching me my granddad wasn't talking in riddles." No figure stepped out that morning. No heavy footfalls. After chores, I walked back and found the pan empty except for 3 berries and a neat line of salt untouched, like an answered letter with room left for my part. I smiled at that and went to work on the west fence. Near sundown, as I carried tools to the shed, I looked up and saw him far back at the timber edge on the ridge above the pasture, half lit in amber light, taller than the serviceberry bushes by a country mile and still as an old stump. He watched me a moment, then turned and moved along the ridge, not away in fear, just onward, deliberate and unhurried. Blue saw him too, gave one soft chuff, and lay back down. That was the last clear sighting I had, and it felt complete, not like something stolen. The offering stayed part of my Thursdays anyway. Same pan, same cedar post, same walkout and back in all weather. Sometimes the food was gone by dawn, sometimes not until noon. Once in a while I found a crossed pair of stones or branches moved clear from the calf path before I got there. Small, practical mercies that kept me honest. Mostly I found what my grandfather must have found for years. A rhythm of giving that mattered whether or not I understood every hand involved. I still get grief days. I still wake at 2 a.m. hearing creek water in my head and worrying over bills. The world did not turn soft because I had one hard spring of help. Water still rises, fences still fail. Engines still crack blocks when folks ignore warning lights. But I live differently now. I ask better questions while there is time to hear answers. I say thank you out loud before silence has to carry it for me. I keep feed stacked for winter and cornbread ready on Thursdays because kindness, I learned, is maintenance just as much as repair. When people in town smirk and call this place legend country, I don't argue. I buy my staples, talk culverts, and go home. If Wade catches my eye, he gives that small nod of his and asks how Blue's hip is doing. My mother visits once a month, sits on the fixed porch and watches June's calf. No calf anymore, really. Bully the mineral block like he owns the county. She still doesn't press for details. She brings apples. Tonight, the pan is on the counter, cooling beside a fresh skillet of cornbread. Rain is moving in gentle from the west. Not flood weather, just enough to darken the dust and sweeten the fur. Blue is asleep by the door, dreaming his paws through some pasture he remembers better than I do. In a minute, I'll carry the offering to the cedar post and stand there in the dim light, where my grandfather stood all those years, a practical man doing a practical kindness for a neighbor he respected. Then I'll walk back to the house, close the door, and sleep as a man who knows he is not alone out here, and never really was.